Mrs. Regina Harris, a beloved teacher, sits at her desk preparing for parent-teacher conferences, but as the door opens, the cold glances and dismissive attitudes of Ethan's parents remind her that, despite her accomplishments, some barriers remain heartbreakingly unbroken. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. The sun was setting behind the school building, casting long shadows across the playground. Inside the classroom, Mrs. Regina Harris sat at her desk, the soft light from her lamp illuminating the room. Papers were neatly stacked in front of her, progress reports, notes from the semester, and reminders she'd jotted down about her students' growth. Parent-teacher conferences were always a pivotal time, and she took them seriously. After all, they were a chance to connect with the parents, to explain not just where their children stood academically, but to share stories of their personal development, their wins, their struggles, their growth as individuals. Despite the importance of these conferences, there was always an undercurrent of tension that she couldn't quite shake. It wasn't the workload, although that was hefty enough. It wasn't the late nights or the stacks of grading that awaited her at home. It was something else, something much heavier, an invisible weight she carried every time she sat across from certain parents. Mrs. Harris glanced at her reflection in the window. A petite woman in her mid-30s, her face showed the signs of long hours and relentless dedication to her work. Her dark skin glowed faintly in the dim light, her tightly coiled hair pinned back in a neat updo, framing her kind yet determined eyes. She had been teaching for over 10 years, and in that time, she had developed a reputation among her colleagues and students as one of the most caring and effective educators in the district. But as she prepared for the upcoming conferences, she knew her qualifications alone were not enough for everyone. The door creaked open, and Mrs. Harris immediately straightened in her chair, preparing herself for the first meeting of the evening. In walked the Richardsons, Ethan's parents. Mr. and Mrs. Richardson were a well-dressed couple, carrying themselves with an air of quiet confidence. Mrs. Richardson wore a tailored jacket over a cream-colored blouse, her hair styled perfectly, and Mr. Richardson followed closely behind, his sharp suit and polished shoes betraying an air of someone used to commanding a room. Mrs. Harris stood, extending her hand with a welcoming smile. "Good evening. I'm Mrs. Harris, your son Ethan's teacher. It's great to finally meet you in person." There was a moment of hesitation, a pause that lasted just a beat too long. Mrs. Richardson's eyes flickered briefly over Mrs. Harris's outstretched hand before she offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She shook Mrs. Harris's hand quickly, almost dismissively, while Mr. Richardson stood a step behind, nodding curtly but offering no handshake of his own. "Good evening," Mrs. Richardson said, her tone polite but cold. "We've heard a lot about you." Mrs. Harris smiled, but inside, she felt the familiar pang of discomfort. She had been in this position before, feeling the unspoken judgments that hung in the air. She was used to it, but it never got easier. There were always parents who, despite knowing her reputation, her skills, and her dedication, couldn't look past the color of her skin. They couldn't see the teacher who had helped hundreds of students succeed, but instead saw a woman who, to them, might not belong in the role they envisioned for their child. "Please, have a seat." Mrs. Harris gestured to the chairs in front of her desk, hoping to break the stiffness with a bit of warmth. As the Richardsons sat down, she noticed the way Mrs. Richardson glanced around the room, taking in the details, the posters of inspirational quotes, the student artwork on the walls, and the educational tools scattered around. It wasn't an unfamiliar sight, yet something in the way she looked at it felt off, as though she was assessing the space through a lens that Mrs. Harris couldn't quite put her finger on. "I've been looking forward to discussing Ethan's progress with you," Mrs. Harris began, turning to Ethan's file in front of her. "He's a bright young boy, and I've seen a lot of potential in him this semester." Mr. Richardson finally spoke, his tone neutral. "We're hoping he's staying on track. Ethan's always been a good student, but lately, well, we've had some concerns." Mrs. Harris nodded. "That's understandable. It's been a challenging semester, especially with the adjustments we've had to make in the curriculum. But Ethan has been doing well, He's made noticeable improvements in math and reading, and his participation in class has increased." As she spoke, she glanced up, expecting to see some signs of engagement from the parents. Instead, she saw Mrs. Richardson flipping through the papers on her lap. Her eyes barely focused on what Mrs. Harris was saying. Mr. Richardson was leaning back slightly in his chair, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the teacher's desk, as though his mind was elsewhere. Mrs. Harris pressed on, determined not to let the cold reception derail the conversation. "I've been working closely with Ethan on his problem-solving skills. He tends to get frustrated when he doesn't understand something right away, but we've been using different strategies to help him approach challenges more calmly. He's responded well to." "I thought his teacher was different," Mrs. Richardson interrupted, her voice suddenly sharper. She glanced at her husband, who nodded in silent agreement. "I mean, we were expecting someone else." For a moment, the room fell silent. The unspoken words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Mrs. Harris had heard these kinds of comments before, though they were rarely stated so openly. Parents who had assumed she wasn't the real teacher, that she couldn't be the one shaping their child's education. They didn't say it outright, but it was always there, beneath the surface. "I assure you," Mrs. Harris said calmly, despite the tightness in her chest, "I've been teaching Ethan all semester, and I've seen him grow both academically and personally. He's been a joy to have in class." Mrs. Richardson didn't respond, her lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Richardson cleared his throat. "Well, we just hope he's being challenged enough." Mrs. Harris nodded, her professional demeanor unwavering. "Ethan has a lot of potential, and I'm committed to making sure he's challenged in ways that help him grow. I've also noticed he excels in creative assignments, so I've been encouraging him to explore more in that area." But the Richardsons weren't listening, at least not fully. Their responses were curt, their expressions disinterested. It was clear that they had already made up their minds about Mrs. Harris before they even stepped into the room. As the meeting wrapped up, Mrs. Harris offered them a final warm smile. "If you have any concerns moving forward, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always here to help." "Thank you," Mrs. Richardson said, her tone polite but hollow. Mr. Richardson gave a quick nod, and without another word, they rose from their chairs and left the room, the door closing softly behind them. Mrs. Harris sat in silence for a moment, staring at the door. She had felt this way before, dismissed, unseen, but tonight it hit harder than usual. Despite all her efforts, all her successes, there were still those who couldn't see past her appearance. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before the next set of parents arrived. There was still a long night ahead, but she knew that no matter how she was perceived, her students' success was what truly mattered. And that, she reminded herself, was worth everything. As she straightened the papers on her desk and prepared for the next meeting, the sound of laughter echoed faintly from the hallway, a reminder of why she did this work in the first place. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the staff room, casting a golden glow across the worn-out couches and small tables cluttered with papers, coffee mugs, and forgotten lunch containers. Mrs. Harris sat quietly at a corner table, sipping from her cup of tea, her mind still lingering on the parent-teacher conferences from the night before. She had faced moments of prejudice and judgment before, but the encounter with the Richardsons left a particular sting she couldn't quite shake. Her classroom was her sanctuary, a place where students were seen for their potential and their hearts, not for the color of their skin or where they came from. But outside those walls, it seemed there were always barriers she had to push through. Last night's meeting with the Richardsons was a stark reminder that, for some, her presence as a black woman in an authoritative position still invited doubt. As she turned over these thoughts, a voice interrupted her. "Regina, you okay?" Mr. Davis, a fellow teacher and friend, leaned against the counter, his brow furrowed in concern. He was tall, with a friendly face and a calming presence that made him a favorite among both students and staff. Mrs. Harris smiled softly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine, Charles. Just thinking." Mr. Davis took a seat beside her, his gaze steady. "I heard about the Richardsons," he said gently, his tone laced with concern. "Word around the halls is they weren't too happy with the meeting." Mrs. Harris let out a sigh, rubbing her temples lightly. I could feel it the moment they walked into the room, she admitted. They didn't even give me a chance to really connect with them. It was like they had already decided who I was before I said a word. Mr. Davis frowned. I've seen that look before. It's frustrating, especially knowing how much you do for these kids. It's beyond frustrating, Mrs. Harris said, her voice tinged with a weariness that came from years of dealing with the same unspoken prejudice. It's exhausting. No matter how hard I work or how much I achieve, there are still some parents who look at me and see, I don't know, someone who shouldn't be teaching their child, someone who's not good enough. She paused, staring into her tea. They don't see the hours I spend preparing lessons or the time I put into helping their children succeed. They don't care that I've been named Teacher of the Year or that I've helped hundreds of students over the years. All they see is what they want to see. Mr. Davis nodded thoughtfully, his expression serious. It's not right. You've earned every bit of your success. I know it, your colleagues know it, and your students definitely know it. Mrs. Harris sighed again, leaning back in her chair. I just wish it didn't feel like I have to prove myself over and over again. It wears on you, you know? I hear you, Mr. Davis said softly, but you've never let it stop you before. And I doubt you'll let it stop you now. Before Mrs. Harris could respond, the door to the staff room opened, and another teacher, Miss Thompson, entered. She was a lively woman in her 50s, always bustling with energy. Today, however, her face was drawn into a tight frown as she glanced around the room. Regina, Charles, she said, her voice low. Did you hear about the Richardsons? Mrs. Harris raised an eyebrow. What about them? They've been talking, Miss Thompson continued, clearly uncomfortable. I overheard them in the office this morning. Apparently they were, let's just say, surprised to see that you're Ethan's teacher. They weren't exactly shy about how they felt. Mrs. Harris felt her stomach tighten, though she forced herself to stay composed. What did they say? Miss Thompson hesitated for a moment, clearly not wanting to upset her further. They were just questioning whether you were the right fit for Ethan, wondering if he was being challenged enough, if you had the experience to handle his needs. Mr. Davis scoffed, shaking his head. That's ridiculous. Regina has more experience than half the staff here, and I've seen the way she works with Ethan. He's thriving under her care. I know, Miss Thompson said quickly. But you know how some parents are. They see something that doesn't fit their expectations, and suddenly, it's like everything else you've accomplished doesn't matter. Mrs. Harris felt a familiar burn of frustration rising in her chest, but she swallowed it down, determined not to let it show. It's fine, she said, her voice steady. I'm used to it by now. But deep down, it wasn't fine. The whispers, the judgments, they wore her down, bit by bit. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she proved herself, there were always going to be people who saw her through a lens of prejudice. As the bell rang, signaling the start of the next class period, Mrs. Harris stood up, gathering her things. I've got to get back to class, she said with a small smile. My kids are waiting. Mr. Davis placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression gentle. You've got this, Regina. Don't let them get in your head. Mrs. Harris nodded, though inside she felt the weight of the conversation settling in. She walked back to her classroom, her mind churning with thoughts of the Richardsons and their whispered complaints. As much as she tried to brush it off, it hurt to know that, after all these years, after all she had accomplished, there were still people who couldn't see beyond their biases. When she reached her classroom, the sight of her students brought a smile to her face. They were already settled in their seats, chatting quietly with one another as they waited for her to start the lesson. This was where she belonged, here, in this space, with these children. They didn't care about the color of her skin or her background. To them, she was just their teacher, someone who cared about them and wanted them to succeed. As she began the lesson, her focus shifted back to her students. But in the back of her mind, the Richardsons' comments lingered, a reminder that there was still a long way to go before she would be seen as the equal she knew she was. By the end of the day, Mrs. Harris was exhausted. Not from the teaching itself, she loved that part, but from the constant pressure to prove herself. As she packed up her things, ready to head home, she couldn't help but wonder if the Richardsons' attitude would affect Ethan. Would he pick up on his parents' unspoken judgments? Would their biases seep into his view of her? She shook her head, pushing the thoughts away. She would continue to teach Ethan the way she always had, with patience, care, and dedication. That was the only thing she could control. And she knew, deep down, that her work would speak for itself in the end. As Mrs. Harris locked her classroom door and stepped into the cool evening air, she took a deep breath, reminding herself of the victories she had achieved over the years. She had faced challenges like this before and had always come out stronger. And while the road ahead might still be full of obstacles, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let anyone diminish her worth. With renewed determination, she headed home, ready to face whatever the next day would bring. Weeks passed since the parent-teacher conferences, and though Mrs. Harris had tried to let go of the sting from the Richardsons' coldness, their judgment still lingered in the back of her mind. She couldn't ignore the fact that despite her best efforts, some parents still viewed her through a lens of bias. But as always, she buried that frustration in her work. Teaching was what she loved, and every day in the classroom was a reminder of why she had chosen this career. Ethan, the Richardsons' son, was one of her more reserved students. He wasn't the loudest or the most outgoing in class, but there was something special about him. He had a quiet intelligence and a creative spark that Mrs. Harris had noticed early in the year. When they'd first started working together, he had been hesitant to raise his hand, unsure of himself. But she had made a point of encouraging him, giving him the space and confidence to express his thoughts. Over the past few weeks, Ethan had begun to blossom. The changes weren't dramatic at first, but Harris noticed them all the same. The way his hand would slowly inch up during class discussions, his willingness to volunteer answers more frequently, and the small smile that played on his lips when he solved a difficult problem. It wasn't just academic growth. It was personal. Ethan was finding his voice, and Mrs. Harris couldn't have been prouder. One afternoon, as the students worked quietly on a group project, Ethan approached her desk with a nervous glance. "Mrs. Harris?" he asked softly. "Yes, Ethan?" she responded, looking up from her notes and offering him an encouraging smile. I don't understand this part of the assignment," he said, holding out his worksheet. His voice was quiet, almost as if he was afraid to ask for help. Mrs. Harris took the paper from his hands and scanned the problem. It was a tricky math question, one that had stumped a few other students as well. She motioned for Ethan to sit beside her. "Let's work through it together," she said, her tone calm and reassuring. "This problem is all about breaking it down into smaller steps. You already know the basics, so let's start there." As they worked through the problem, Mrs. Harris could see the wheels turning in Ethan's mind. His brow furrowed as he concentrated, but slowly, the confusion began to lift from his face. She guided him patiently, asking questions and prompting him to think about the next step. "There you go," she said softly as he finally solved the problem, a sense of pride filling her voice. "See, you've got this." Ethan looked up at her, his face lighting up with a mixture of relief and excitement. "I did it," he whispered, almost in disbelief. "You did," Mrs. Harris said with a wide smile. "And you figured it out because you didn't give up. That's what's important." Ethan nodded, his confidence growing a little more with each passing moment. "Thanks, Mrs. Harris." "You're welcome, Ethan," she replied. "You're doing really well. Just keep working like this, and you'll be surprised at how much you can achieve." He returned to his seat, and Mrs. Harris watched as he shared his success with his group. It was moments like this that made all the challenges of teaching worthwhile. No award or recognition could ever compare to the joy of seeing a student overcome their own doubts and realize their potential. As the days went by, Ethan's progress continued to shine. He began to raise his hand more often, not just in response to questions, but to contribute his ideas to class discussions. He showed a natural curiosity in science and math, and Mrs. Harris nurtured that interest, giving him additional resources and encouraging him to explore subjects that excited him. But what stood out most was how Ethan had begun to carry himself with more confidence. His shoulders no longer slouched in class, and the hesitant glances he used to cast toward his peers had been replaced by a quiet sense of self-assurance. Mrs. Harris knew that the academic improvement was only part of his journey. What truly mattered was that he was learning to believe in himself. One day, during recess, Ethan stayed behind in the classroom, as he often did. Mrs. Harris had noticed that he preferred the quiet of the classroom to the chaos of the playground, and she didn't mind. She enjoyed these quiet moments where students felt comfortable enough to approach her without the distractions of the rest of the class. "Mrs. Harris?" Ethan's voice broke the silence. "Yes, Ethan?" She looked up from the papers she was grading. "I was wondering, do you think I'm good at math?" he asked, his voice tentative. Mrs. Harris set her pen down and turned her full attention to him. "I think you're very good at math," she said sincerely. "But more importantly, I think you're good at thinking through problems and not giving up when things get tough. That's what makes you a great student." Ethan smiled, a genuine shy smile that reached his eyes. "I didn't used to like math that much, but now it's kind of fun." Mrs. Harris felt a swell of pride. "That's because you're starting to see what you're capable of. Math, or any subject, is all about learning how to think, how to approach challenges. And you've been doing that really well." "Thanks," Ethan said, his voice soft but filled with gratitude. "You don't need to thank me, Ethan. You're the one doing all the hard work," Mrs. Harris replied. "I'm just here to help guide you along the way." The rest of the day passed in a blur of lessons and activities, but the conversation with Ethan stuck with Mrs. Harris. It reminded her of why she had chosen this profession, why she poured so much of herself into her students. Teaching wasn't just about imparting knowledge. It was about helping children discover their strengths, guiding them through challenges, and giving them the confidence to pursue their dreams. As the semester continued, Ethan's progress became undeniable. His test scores improved, his participation in class increased, and he seemed more engaged with his peers. Mrs. Harris had even noticed that he had started helping other students with their work, offering quiet assistance when they struggled with a problem. But as proud as Mrs. Harris was of Ethan, she couldn't help but wonder how his parents would react. Would the Richardsons notice the change in their son? Would they acknowledge the growth he had made, not just academically, but personally? She couldn't know for sure. But she hoped that when the time came for them to see Ethan's progress, they would finally understand that the work she was doing was more than just teaching. It was shaping the future of every child who walked into her classroom. By the end of the semester, Mrs. Harris had gathered the final grades and prepared the progress reports. Ethan's performance had improved significantly, and his overall development was evident in every aspect of his work. As she sat at her desk, reviewing his report, she couldn't help but smile. He had come so far in such a short time, and she was proud of every step he had taken. As the final bell of the day rang, Mrs. Harris watched as her students packed up their things and headed out for winter break. Ethan lingered near the door, giving her a small wave before he left. "See you next year, Mrs. Harris," he said with a smile that was no longer shy, but full of quiet confidence. "See you next year, Ethan," she replied, her heart swelling with pride. As the classroom emptied, Mrs. Harris sat back in her chair, a sense of fulfillment washing over her. No matter what the Richardsons thought or said about her, she knew the truth. She was making a difference in the lives of her students, and that was all that mattered. Still, the thought of the upcoming school award ceremony hung in the back of her mind. It would be a chance for the school community, including the parents, to see just how much she had accomplished with her students this year, including Ethan. What she didn't yet know was how that evening would shift everything she thought she understood about the Richardsons and their view of her. The day of the school awards ceremony had finally arrived, and the entire campus buzzed with excitement. Students dressed in their best, proud parents clutching cameras and bouquets of flowers, and teachers beaming with pride as they helped set up the auditorium for the big night. It was an annual tradition, an evening dedicated to recognizing the hard work of both students and teachers alike, celebrating academic achievements, personal growth, and the tireless efforts of the educators who made it all possible. For Mrs. Harris, the evening carried a bittersweet anticipation. She loved these ceremonies. They were a chance to see her students honored for the hard work they'd put in all year. But there was a nagging worry in the back of her mind, one she couldn't shake. She hadn't seen the Richardsons since the parent-teacher conference, but she knew they'd be attending tonight, sitting in the audience. And though she didn't want to dwell on it, the memory of their coldness still weighed on her heart. Would they see tonight as an opportunity to engage with her work and their son's growth, or would they continue to dismiss her efforts? In her heart, Mrs. Harris knew that her work had value, that she was helping to shape young lives and giving them the tools they needed to succeed. She had seen the transformation in Ethan firsthand, and that, to her, was the true reward. But tonight, the school was presenting a special award to her, recognizing her as Teacher of the Year for her outstanding dedication to her students. It was an honor she had earned through years of hard work, and while she knew it wouldn't change the minds of those like the Richardsons, she hoped that perhaps, seeing her up there, the parents would finally understand the depth of her commitment. As the evening approached, Mrs. Harris found herself fidgeting with her outfit, an elegant but modest black dress she had chosen for the occasion. She wasn't one to seek out the spotlight, but tonight wasn't about her. It was about her students, about Ethan, and about proving that no matter the prejudices she faced, her work spoke for itself. The auditorium filled quickly as families and students poured in, the sound of excited chatter echoing off the walls. The stage was adorned with colorful banners, each representing different aspects of the school's mission: excellence, integrity, and growth. Mrs. Harris took a deep breath, standing backstage as the principal began the opening remarks. "Good evening, everyone." Principal Walters greeted the crowd, his voice booming through the microphone. "Tonight, we are here to celebrate the hard work and dedication of our students, as well as the teachers who have guided them. It's an evening to honor those who have gone above and beyond, not only in their academic achievements, but in their personal growth as well." Applause rippled through the audience, and Mrs. Harris peeked out from behind the curtain. Her heart skipped a beat as she spotted the Richardsons seated near the front. Mrs. Richardson sat with perfect posture, her face unreadable, while Mr. Richardson glanced around the room, his expression more relaxed than she remembered. But it was Ethan who caught her attention. He sat between them, his eyes wide with anticipation, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Mrs. Harris smiled softly. Ethan had come a long way since the start of the semester, and tonight he would be one of the students recognized for his incredible progress. She hoped that his parents would see just how much he had achieved under her guidance. The ceremony moved along, with awards being presented to students for academic excellence, leadership, and sportsmanship. The crowd cheered as each name was called, and proud parents stood to take pictures, their faces glowing with pride. Mrs. Harris clapped along with the rest, her heart swelling as she watched her students receive their honors. It was moments like these that reminded her why she had chosen to be a teacher. And now, Principal Walters announced, his voice gaining a new level of excitement. "We come to one of the most important awards of the evening. This award is given to a teacher who has gone above and beyond, someone who has made a lasting impact on their students, and has exemplified what it means to be an outstanding educator." Mrs. Harris's breath caught in her throat as the principal continued. "This teacher is someone who has consistently shown dedication, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to helping every student succeed. She has been a guiding light for many of her students, helping them find their voices, gain confidence, and reach their full potential. It is my great honor to present the Teacher of the Year Award to Mrs. Regina Harris." The applause was thunderous. Mrs. Harris stepped out from behind the curtain, her heart pounding in her chest as she made her way to the stage. The lights were bright, almost blinding, but she could make out the silhouettes of the cheering crowd, her colleagues standing and applauding. As she reached the podium, she took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she accepted the plaque from Principal Walters. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "I'm honored to receive this award, but the truth is, this recognition belongs to my students. They are the reason I do what I do. Every day, I am inspired by their curiosity, their resilience, and their capacity for growth. Being a teacher is not just a job to me, it's a privilege. I am grateful for the opportunity to help shape the lives of these incredible young people. As she spoke, her eyes scanned the audience, and she couldn't help but notice the Richardsons. Mrs. Richardson's expression had shifted. Her face was no longer unreadable. There was something there. Surprise, perhaps even admiration. Mr. Richardson, too, seemed to be paying closer attention, his posture more engaged. But it was Ethan's face that brought tears to Mrs. Harris's eyes. He was beaming, his smile wide and proud, as if her award was his own victory. And finally, Mrs. Harris continued, her voice softening, I want to thank the parents who trust me with their children. Your support means everything, and I promise to continue giving my all to help your children thrive, not just as students, but as people. With that, she stepped back from the podium, the applause swelling around her once again. As she descended the stairs, her colleagues congratulated her, patting her on the back and offering warm smiles. But despite the joy of the moment, Mrs. Harris's thoughts were focused on one thing. What would the Richardsons say now? After the ceremony, the auditorium lobby filled with excited chatter as families mingled with teachers and students. Harris found herself surrounded by her colleagues, each offering congratulations and kind words. She smiled and thanked them, but her eyes kept drifting toward the Richardsons, who stood near the exit, speaking quietly among themselves. Before she could think about it too much, Ethan broke away from his parents and ran toward her, his face glowing with excitement. Mrs. Harris, he called, his voice bright. Congratulations, you're the best teacher ever. Mrs. Harris knelt down, her heart swelling at his enthusiasm. Thank you, Ethan. I'm really proud of you too, you know. You've worked so hard this year. Ethan grinned, his eyes sparkling. I like learning now. You made school fun. Mrs. Harris's chest tightened with emotion. I'm so glad to hear that, Ethan. You've come so far. As Ethan's parents approached, Mrs. Harris stood up, her smile polite but guarded. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she was determined to remain gracious, no matter their reaction. Mrs. Richardson was the first to speak, her voice softer than it had been during their first meeting. Mrs. Harris, we just wanted to say thank you. Mrs. Harris blinked, momentarily taken aback. Thank you? Yes. Mr. Richardson chimed in, his tone sincere. We've seen a big change in Ethan. He's been so excited about school lately, and we know that because of you. Mrs. Richardson nodded, her expression no longer cold but thoughtful. We didn't understand at first, and we may have been too quick to judge. But after seeing how much Ethan has grown, it's clear that you've had a huge impact on him. Mrs. Harris stood in stunned silence for a moment, absorbing their words. She hadn't expected this, a genuine acknowledgement of her work and an apology, however subtle. It was a small victory, but it meant more than she could put into words. I'm glad to hear that Ethan's doing well, she said, her voice warm. He's a wonderful student, and it's been a joy to watch him grow. Mrs. Richardson smiled, and it was the first time Mrs. Harris had seen warmth in her eyes. We're very grateful, Mrs. Harris. Thank you for everything. As the Richardsons walked away with Ethan, Mrs. Harris stood there, a quiet sense of fulfillment washing over her. It wasn't just the award or the recognition from her peers that made the evening special. It was this, the realization that, despite the barriers, despite the prejudices, her work was making a difference, and sometimes that difference was enough to change hearts. As the auditorium slowly emptied, Mrs. Harris took a deep breath, her heart light. She had faced her challenges head-on, and tonight she had been reminded that change was possible, both in her students and in the world around her. The drive home from the award ceremony was a quiet one for Mrs. Harris. The night sky, punctuated by stars, seemed to mirror the tranquility she felt inside. Her emotions were swirling, but not in the chaotic way they had been after her first meeting with the Richardsons. Tonight, they were calm, steady even. There was a sense of closure that wrapped around her like a warm blanket, comforting and reassuring. She replayed the events of the evening in her mind, the applause, Ethan's wide grin, the unexpected and heartfelt apology from his parents. It all felt like a culmination of years of hard work, not just in her classroom, but in her life. Every hurdle she had faced, every moment of doubt, had led her to this point, and tonight it seemed that even those who had once dismissed her were finally beginning to see her for who she truly was, a dedicated, capable, and caring teacher. As she pulled into her driveway, the familiar sight of her small, cozy home greeted her. Mrs. Harris parked the car and sat for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the peace of the evening wash over her. For the first time in weeks, she felt a weight lifting, a sense that the battle she had been fighting against bias, against prejudice, had shifted. If only slightly. It wasn't over, of course. She knew there would always be more challenges, more moments where she would have to prove herself again and again. But tonight, she had won a small, personal victory. With a deep breath, she grabbed her purse and the Teacher of the Year plaque, feeling its weight in her hands. It was a tangible symbol of her achievements, but to Mrs. Harris it represented something much more, validation, not just from her colleagues, but from her students, and finally, from parents like the Richardsons. Stepping inside, she set the plaque down on the kitchen table and made herself a cup of tea. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. She had always liked this part of the day, the quiet moments after a long day of teaching, where she could reflect and prepare herself for whatever was to come next. Tonight, though, felt different. There was a sense of finality in the air, as if a chapter in her life had closed and a new one was about to begin. As she sipped her tea, her thoughts returned to Ethan. She smiled, remembering his excitement after the ceremony, the way he had run up to her with such joy, calling her the best teacher ever. Those words, spoken so simply, meant more to her than any award ever could. They were a reminder of why she did what she did, why she got up every morning, why she stayed late grading papers, and why she poured her heart and soul into her students. It was for moments like that, when a child found the confidence to believe in themselves, when they saw their own potential reflected in the eyes of their teacher. The next morning, Mrs. Harris woke with a sense of renewed purpose. The sun streamed through the curtains, casting a soft glow over her bedroom, and she felt ready for whatever lay ahead. The winter break was approaching, and though she looked forward to the rest, she was already thinking about her students, especially Ethan, and how she could continue to help them grow in the new year. As she arrived at school, the atmosphere was buzzing with the usual pre-holiday excitement. Students were chatting excitedly about their winter plans, and the hallways were decorated with festive posters and paper snowflakes. Mrs. Harris made her way to her classroom, her thoughts focused on the upcoming lessons and final projects before the break. Just as she was about to step inside her room, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Mrs. Harris?" She turned to see Mrs. Richardson standing there, bundled in a coat, her face slightly flushed from the cold air outside. There was a softness in her expression that hadn't been there before. It wasn't the guarded look Mrs. Harris had seen during the parent-teacher conference, nor was it the cold dismissal from their first meeting. Today, Mrs. Richardson seemed different, warmer, perhaps even nervous. "Good morning, Mrs. Richardson," Mrs. Harris said, her voice calm but curious. "How can I help you?" Mrs. Richardson hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. I just wanted to stop by and say thank you, again, for everything you've done for Ethan." Mrs. Harris smiled but didn't interrupt, sensing that Mrs. Richardson had more to say. "We've been talking at home," Mrs. Richardson continued, glancing down at her hands before meeting Mrs. Harris's eyes again, "about how much Ethan has changed this year. He's more confident, more engaged with his schoolwork. He even talks about what he wants to be when he grows up now. He didn't do that before." Mrs. Harris's heart warmed at the thought of Ethan dreaming about his future. "That's wonderful to hear," she said softly. "Ethan has a lot of potential. I'm so glad he's finding his way." Mrs. Richardson nodded, her expression growing more thoughtful. "We didn't see it at first," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "When we met you, I know we were cold, distant even, and that wasn't right. We made assumptions. We didn't see how much you were doing for Ethan." Mrs. Harris remained silent, letting Mrs. Richardson speak her truth. "I'm sorry for that," Mrs. Richardson said, her voice thick with sincerity. "I see now how much you've helped him. You've made a real difference in his life, and I was too blind to see it at the time. But I do now." There was a vulnerability in Mrs. Richardson's voice that Mrs. Harris hadn't expected, and it touched her deeply. This wasn't just an apology, it was a moment of real understanding, of someone recognizing their own biases and choosing to confront them. "Thank you for saying that," Mrs. Harris replied, her voice gentle. "I appreciate it, and I'm just glad that Ethan is doing so well. That's always been my goal, to help my students grow and succeed no matter what challenges they face." Mrs. Richardson smiled, a real, genuine smile this time. "Well, you've done that, and we're grateful, truly." With that, Mrs. Richardson turned to leave, but before she did, she paused and glanced back at Mrs. Harris one last time. "I know we've had our differences, but if there's anything we can do to support you or help Ethan even more, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're behind you now." Mrs. Harris felt a lump rise in her throat, and she nodded, her heart full. "I will. Thank you, Mrs. Richardson." As the door closed behind Ethan's mother, Mrs. Harris stood there for a moment, processing the conversation. She hadn't expected such a heartfelt apology, nor had she expected the Richardsons to come around so completely. But in that moment, she realized something important. Change was possible, even in the most unlikely of places. Her journey as a teacher had been full of moments like this, moments of struggle, of doubt, but also moments of triumph and transformation. And while the challenges weren't over, tonight's ceremony and Mrs. Richardson's words were proof that sometimes the hardest battles yielded the most meaningful victories. As the day unfolded, Mrs. Harris returned to her classroom, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. She greeted her students with a renewed sense of joy, knowing that no matter the obstacles she faced, she was making a difference. She had chosen this path not because it was easy, but because it was right. And now, as she looked around her classroom, filled with eager young faces, she knew that every struggle was worth it. And though the road ahead would surely bring new challenges, Mrs. Harris was ready to face them head-on, knowing that she had the strength, the resilience, and the love of her students to guide her through. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.